Welcome to this second panel, The Ethics of Writing Dementia Fiction. My name is Gemma Carney and I'm one of the research team on the Dementia Fiction project here at Queen's. I'm a gerontologist, which means that I study all different kinds of implications of our ageing population for culture and society. So I'm going to chair this really fascinating panel today. If you're interested in any way in dementia fiction, it will have occurred to you that the challenges of writing about a condition which affects a person's ability, that one of the biggest challenges is to avoid appropriation while also producing an authentic voice. So surely a basic premise of avoiding appropriation of people's experience of dementia, or indeed any disability, is to listen to those with the experience of impairment. Nothing about us without us. And that's been central to the ethos of our project and to the approach taken in organising our Dementia Fiction Festival. So rather than avoiding the difficult questions, we've decided to stay with the trouble, as one of our panellists, Sarah Falkus, has recommended, to confront the shameful silences and omissions that have characterised some research on dementia. And despite coming from very different perspectives, this commitment to include the voice of people with dementia has united us as a research team. We're a couple of social scientists, myself and Paula Devine, who run the ARC Ageing programme, an author, Jan Carson, who's running our festival, and a couple of literary linguists, Jane, who you met this morning, and Carolina Fernandez. So we shared a common goal to engage people with dementia in our project, and also the people who care for them, and those who work directly with people with dementia. So the experience of living with dementia has been central to our project throughout. But we cannot say that we have direct experience of a dementia diagnosis. So for the next hour and for this panel, we're going to take on this most challenging of questions. How can we write about dementia in an ethical way? Our panellists all have extensive and varied experience of thinking about, writing about, or living with dementia. Pete Middleton was born in 1954. He's been a member of the Royal Air Force and a police community support officer. Pete is living with dementia and he joins us from Northamptonshire. Next, we have Sarah Falkus. Sarah works at the University of Huddersfield, where she studies contemporary literature. Sarah is very well known in my field of cultural gerontology, and her book, Contemporary Narratives of Dementia, Ethics, Ageing, Politics, is a must-read for students and scholars. Henrietta McCurvey is a Dublin-based author who's won numerous awards for her 4 novels, and today she's going to read from her book, The Heart of Everything. And Caleb Claces teaches creative writing and English Lit at York St John University. He's a novelist and a poet, and he's currently writing a novel about his father's dementia experience.
Thank you, Gemma. Hi, everyone. I feel inadequate to this task of talking about the ethics of writing about dementia, because the truth is I don't. I write about people writing about dementia, and I'm joined by people who do that writing and people who are living with dementia, so forgive me if anything seems not quite from the right perspective. But as Jane was telling us this morning, there's been a massive growth in published Anglophone narratives of dementia in recent years. But if we step back for a moment from those published narratives, we can see that there are many competing cultural narratives or stories of dementia. And here's some of them. There's the biomedical narrative, the tale of neurons, tangles, brain images, pharmaceutical interventions, characterized by pathology, prognosis, tests and trajectories. This is not to say, of course, that medicine and medical research are not crucial, both to those living with dementia and to society at large, but to make the point that they do have a language and they have certain focuses that create particular stories of dementia. There's the economic and statistical story, the burden of care, the ageing population, the cost of ill health. Often expressed in scary statistics, these narratives tend to stress impending doom and trade on what cultural and age studies critic Kathleen Woodward calls statistical panic. In cultural terms, it's hard to disentangle the story of dementia from that of demographic change. This is in large part because dementia is so inextricably associated with ageing. Whilst it is, of course, the case that the incidence of dementia does rise with increasing age, the close association of ageing and dementia exceeds that. It becomes, as critics have argued, a kind of Alzheimerization of old age, where dementia comes to stand for a kind of bad old age in opposition to a successful old age with cognitive health. Other cultural narratives then intersect with these economic and statistical stories. As Jane outlined this morning, we have that loss of self narrative, the narrative of an increasing loss of personhood as the person with dementia becomes less or less themselves and increasingly someone without a self at all. But these are, of course, not the only stories of dementia out there. There are narratives that compete with these, as Jane was telling us this morning, Tom Kitwood's personhood movement that challenges the loss of self narrative and reimagines dementia care. There are also narratives propounded by various advocacy groups, support groups and activists, the idea of living well with dementia, various forms of dementia friends, dementia friendliness. All of these cultural narratives have specific implications for the ways in which we understand dementia and life with dementia. So why do we need fictional narratives? I think Jane's already kind of suggested why this might be the case. But to answer this, I'll reiterate some thoughts about dementia and storytelling. So language and stories are inherently associated with memory, with time, the connection of words and ideas to create a coherent narrative. And that ability, as Jane said, is associated with selfhood itself. The idea that without that ability to tell our story, we're no longer selves at all. The challenge then is that dementia and narrative may come to seem antithetical. Dementia is associated with what my colleague Heike Harting calls the limits of narrativity. But we can rethink that. What if the very temporality of narrative and its flexibility make it perfect for the expression of life with and the experience of dementia? More than this, stories of dementia may also be places where the cultural narratives I've described are interrogated, and some questions of personhood, dignity, agency, and care can be both played out and explored. Stories, then, might give us ways of thinking about and understanding that other coverage of life with dementia may not offer. They might not be stories of dementia, but stories of life with dementia, stories of individuals, of families, and communities. Narrative is about imagination. It's about thinking beyond the limits of ourselves and our environments. That's a good part of why we insist upon our children reading. And narrative is about feeling, as Jane said, about emotion, even about that tricky word, empathy. It's not just about imagining the lives of others, but about feeling with and alongside them. But with these stories, with these fictions that we're going to talk about, come dangers of misunderstanding, reduction of complexity, even perhaps stereotyping. Narrative may itself have limits, as does empathy, which may indeed fail. So this all raises lots of questions for us to talk about today. But to sum up this brief introduction, before I pose some particular questions, as my co-author and I expressed it in our book about narratives of dementia, we need to consider the ethical need for the representation of dementia and the ethical dangers of such representations. So some specific questions. I'm not suggesting in any way that we limit our discussion to these or that they're in any way comprehensive either. There's such a lot of things we can talk about. But to go back to where Gemma started in her introduction, is there a danger of appropriation in writing about dementia? This brings a related question of who has the right to tell these stories. Are writers, if they don't themselves live with dementia, simply appropriating the experience of cognitive illness? Is there a danger of a kind of exploitation here, especially when a novel is dealing with intimate and subjective experience, as of course they inevitably do? This raises that related tricky term of authenticity. Clearly, this is of concern to readers, but what does it mean when writing about dementia? Is then some sense of authorization needed? Cultural authorization is often seen in author biographies and taglines, and it's clear that authors do draw upon and are often inspired by real-life experiences, often with family members. I'm concentrating here really, and I think we are in this panel, upon fiction, but when we think about memoir and autobiographical and biographical stories, these issues take on especially sharp relevance. There's a panel on this tomorrow, so I'm not going to be talking about it in lots of detail. But the idea of a real person's experience with dementia being related on the page brings with it very particular ethical questions and issues of privacy, consent, and vulnerability. Another question then, what kind of research needs to go into writing about dementia? Authors, as I've said, very clearly draw upon personal experience. Others talk to people living with dementia, their family members, perhaps carers or healthcare professionals. Others undertake academic or more paper-based research. Is there an ethical necessity to undertake this in order to write about dementia? Is this central to the idea of authenticity and a way of avoiding appropriation. What kinds of stories then should be written about dementia? We could argue that there is a sense in which particular stories do dominate in the writing of dementia, and I would argue that that is changing in recent years. But so we have, for example, the classic narrative of a tragic, brilliant person lost through dementia, or the romantic narrative of a person lost and maybe fleetingly found again, or a familial story in which forgetting associated with dementia becomes central to a plot of inheritance and sometimes also to illegitimacy. Whose stories then are told? One question that will be picked up in a later panel is which kinds of stories of dementia are told and whose voices are heard. There's a danger of lack of representation, I think, of the diversity of people living with dementia, and we could go on about this and perhaps will. There is, for example, in picture books about dementia, a focus on the experience of white, older, middle-class people living with dementia. Conversely, there are a lot of novels about early onset. How then should we write about dementia? Published fiction is an aesthetic product. These authors, these writers, are aestheticizing dementia. So what decisions might that involve, and what might be the ethics of those decisions? And obviously we've touched upon that already this morning, so I'm just going to really briefly pick up a few of those points. One thing that seems to be really key to a lot of this project and also to wider studies is point of view and the representation of the subjective experience of the person living with dementia. Is it important always to offer this? Most authors do, in fact, but some don't. And The Bear Came Over the Mountain was offered as an example of that this morning. And some writers offer changes in point of view to manipulate the relationship between reader and character with dementia. How then is that point of view actually written? Some authors exploit language itself to do it, as the last panel discussed, using fragmented prose, non sequiturs, and syntactic confusion. Is this a way of pushing against the limits of narrativity? What are then the opportunities as well in terms of time and the treatment of time in novels about dementia, including memory and the past, connections to a broader familial, communal, or even national past, and the subjective experience of past and present? And also, and sometimes we forget about this, what about the sense of the future? How can this be represented in a story about dementia? More broadly, what are the ethics of the ways that characters living with dementia are represented? For example, in the choice of symptoms represented, which I think has come up in some of the discussion, many narratives about dementia focus on memory loss as its dominant symptom. But this could itself perhaps homogenize the experience of those with dementia. I think we've already touched upon imagery and metaphor, but these are so important to our understanding of life with dementia. The rising incidence of dementia is often explored and characterized in apocalyptic imagery in the media, for example, as a tsunami or similar terms. The Gothic, haunting, zombies are often used as ways of describing life and those living with dementia. In picture books about dementia, which I'm studying, hence the examples, we often get mechanistic explanations of dementia as a poorly brain or something similar. What are the effects of particular imaginative and metaphorical strategies? And what are the ethics? Finally, then, what might the demands of genre do to the representation of dementia? We can think of this in relation to the many recent mystery and crime novels that have included a character living with dementia in recent years, and the Elizabeth Healy novel Elizabeth is Missing this morning. Is dementia used simply to intensify mystery, or as a kind of plot device? Or might what we call genre fiction offer some real representational opportunities? Might also non-realist genres offer some interesting perspectives? I want to leave us with a final question then, and hopefully come in bang on 10 minutes. How should we read about dementia? I've spent a lot of time thinking about how authors should write, what they have to think about, hopefully not in any way limiting their creative expression. But the question of appropriation doesn't just apply to authors. What about readers? Are we simply appropriating the experience of others, imagining that we can completely understand them and that we can entirely empathise? We can entirely imagine what it is like to walk in those shoes. Does that mean we need to approach stories of dementia in particular ways? Is there an ethics of reading as well as an ethics of writing? Thank you.
That's brilliant, Sarah. Thank you so much. I think I have loads of questions, and you've given us some lovely things to think about there. But I think I'll just keep things going, and we'll hand over to Henrietta, and we can all kind of ferment and think about Sarah's questions while we listen to Henrietta's piece of work.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to read from The Heart of Everything, which the character is Mags is in the early stages of dementia in this book. She doesn't have a formal diagnosis yet, and she goes missing. So the idea of the book was it was a missing woman story, but also I wanted to explore the idea of what happens when someone feels like they go missing to themselves or go missing within their own lives or missing within the lives of others. At one point, Mags thinks, will I miss me when I'm gone? She has 3 adult children who are estranged for reasons which become clear in the book due to a tragedy a couple of years earlier. And her eldest daughter, with whom she spends the most time, who lives nearby, is a very uptight woman called Anita. And the bit I'm about to read is told from Anita's point of view when she is called to Mag's house and Mags isn't there. Cross, cranky, snappy, snarky, call it what you will, it's what she was. Anita was to think back often on that day, and every time she did, she would hate herself for how cross she had been. Cross that her mother had gone out without letting her know what her plans were for the morning. Cross that she was late coming back. Cross at the nerve of her wasting Anita's time like that. Anita had sat at home in the lounge and looked out at her long, neat garden and tapped her feet. Honestly, Mum really would get your goat. She had dialed her mother's number. She was to collect her for the dentist at 2 and wanted to remind her to be ready on time because the rest of Anita's carefully scheduled afternoon would fall apart if they ran late. No answer. Mobile the same, though she hardly ever answered it, so nothing new there. Hadn't she left Anita sitting waiting for hours just a few weeks before when she'd come to collect her for a day trip into town? She'd forgotten and headed in on the bus by herself, was all she had to say, which wasn't much of an apology in Anita's world. Anita sat and fumed. Mum is never on time. She's one of those people. But she was becoming more than one of those people now. She knew that. The consultant had told him so. Mr. Cooney had turned his iPhone over and over in his hand the entire time they'd been in his office and was talking into it before they were out the door. Barely bothering to lift his eyes from his notes, he had spoken about symptoms of cognitive impairment this, and the complexity of memory-related conditions that, and the need for early dementia monitoring the other. And of course that, my God, that word, that horrible word, was a shocking thing to hear. And her mother had been upset, and Anita had been upset. But the reality of the situation was that Mum hadn't seemed any different from usual since. Anita had begun to wonder if the whole episode wasn't just a blip and the GP had overreacted. She'd had some funny turns in the past with her thyroid, after all. It had come to a surprise to Anita that the GP even suggested they see a consultant in the first place. A surprise to Mum, too. Anita was sure of it. It can be a slow process, he told them. Complex, for some. We'll monitor the situation, of course, he'd said. We'll speak again soon, he'd said, and told them his secretary would be in touch about the additional tests he wanted to run. He wouldn't prescribe any medication just yet, he told them, when Anita asked why he wasn't giving them a script. Diagnoses are a complex business, he'd said, looking down at the dark screen in his hand. They had left the consultant's office in silence. Mum sat there on the drive home, her handbag clutched tight as an injured pet on her lap. They were nearly back at Booterstown when she said, her voice almost a whisper, "But isn't everything in the world memory-related? Isn't memory just another word for life?" And in the long days and weeks and months that on that day were yet to come, Anita was to look back at the morning she sat in her lounge and wonder why she wasn't immediately worried, didn't get panicked, why she hadn't immediately searched for clues that could have been hidden in her mother's behaviour, ready to be picked out like Hansel and Gretel's tale of breadcrumbs. And she would always wonder, did that say more about her, Anita, than her mother? Could that be possible? Because for years she had believed she was the only one who cared. Raymond couldn't give a fiddlers. And as for Elin, well, Anita tries never to think about Elin. No, it's always been Anita, the one who was nearby, who wanted the best, tried to mind their mother and help her with everything. But in those long days and weeks and months that were to follow, she would have time to wonder if that really was the case. Up until now, she had told herself the reason she didn't notice any significant difference in her mother was because there was no difference to spot. How can you ignore nothing? But could it be true, as Raymond was yet to accuse her, but he would, that what she was doing was trying to deny Mags the right to grow old? Refusing her the messy humanity of ageing is how he will phrase it, though neither of them knows it yet. Anita was like a child, he would hiss at her, a child with her hands clamped over her eyes, calling, "You can't see me." During the horrible week that on this afternoon hadn't even begun, Raymond was to shout that she was trying to capture their mother, to trap her, a butterfly fixed on a pin. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrietta. That's absolutely beautiful imagery there. So the idea now is that we get some responses from Pete and Caleb. Do any of you want to come in there and give us some of your responses to either some of the questions that Sarah has asked or to some of Henrietta's writing?
Go ahead, Pete.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, thanks very much, Sarah and Henrietta. Mags, the character in Henrietta's book, I feel some resonance with Mags, but of course, as we never tire of telling people, us people who are living with dementia, that when you've met one person with dementia, you've met one person with dementia. We're all on different journeys, but I think there is a commonality between us, and other people who I've spoken to will tell me regularly that one is members of the public tend to think that the day you have your diagnosis, all the marbles fall out of your jar, whereas in fact they're dropping out one at a time, slowly. And secondly, that you can live a normal life. It's just that every now and then you're confronted with your own humanity. You're confronted by a mistake that will pull you up short, and that you have to face, and that's the evidence of your decline. So I don't think there is a right and a wrong way to write about dementia ethically, as long as the person you're writing for understands that you're writing about an individual, and that individual may not be the same as the individual that they're thinking about, who was their loved one.
Brilliant. Caleb, did you want to respond to that or come in?
Yeah, I suppose there's a general theme in what Sarah was talking about, which is and has been kind of present in the conference so far, about personhood. And I think for me, one of the things about writing or attempting to write about this subject is that rather than thinking about the writer as somehow someone who can give back or represent a person with dementia as a person again, if you see what I mean, as though it's something to recuperate, that truly opening oneself up, if one isn't somebody who is living with dementia but attempting to write that, truly opening oneself up to that experience would widen the category of a person, right? And would allow that to be something larger in the literature. And I think in terms of what fiction can do, I suppose there are a couple of things that I come back to in terms of fiction's energies, right? One is the idea of change, and the idea that of allowing a person to change in quite radical ways, and how we might tell stories that aren't about a kind of fixed identity, which then sort of falls away, but one in which you might have multiple identities over the course of your life, which of course we all do, right? I mean, I have a month-old child that will be radically different in 6 months' time, let alone, when he's 70 or 80. And the other is, I think, a sense of connection, which I think is something that Henrietta's novel does brilliantly, is show how we're all held in place by networks of connections. And something Pete was saying actually before we came on was we're all different people when we're around different people, right? When we're around our family or when we're in a work context. And kind of showing that perhaps there's a continuity between that kind of change in a different network and the kind of change that people go through at this point in one's life.
And that's certainly something that we really discovered as we got to know these characters with dementia who we used in our research. So they're fictional characters, but to me, Jake and Saul and Maud, they're all real people in my mind now. And one of the things that we found really appealing, and what for me as a social scientist, I think is really, it's a very ethical way to do research, because we were able to engage with some of the, possible scenarios you might experience as a person with dementia, but in a way that we weren't affecting anybody's real life, because this was a fictional character. So the authors had done us a massive favor. So when we were having, say, a reading group with social work students, they're getting a chance to think about how would they respond to somebody with their cognitive impairment without ever having to actually go into the personal details or lives of anyone, because it's a fictional character. And then that also allowed them a certain freedom. So that was the thing that I was thinking, we could look at a little bit more in this session, is around this idea of when we construct a narrative, when we have stories of what it's like to live with dementia, isn't that actually quite liberating for all of us? Because it allows us to tackle one of the biggest challenges for aging societies, which is to imagine our future selves and to be not afraid and fearful of that future. So Henrietta, has it made you think about your own aging when you're doing this kind of writing, or what would it be like for me?
Yeah. And I mean, as I said earlier, it was a close family member's experiences reflected in the book. But it also has made me think, and this speaks to something you were talking about, Peter, the idea that if you have a dementia diagnosis, all your marbles are gone. There's that sense of, oh, well, that's them gone, Whereas I didn't want that to be the case with this character. It's early enough that everybody else around her has to react. And she has a different relationship with each of her children who are estranged from each other. So their relationships all have to change with her and with each other. So rather than it being like this fixed, we're in a box now and this is how we all react to the box, it explodes everything out and everything has to resettle, So I thought that was part of the job of the narrative I was trying to do, was expand it beyond the person themselves, or in a kind of a linear way, and allow everybody else around it to be messy and lose, their own marbles one at a time each around it as well.
Brilliant. And I was really struck as well by some of the questions. We might try and tackle some of the questions that Sarah put to us. So as a researcher, I was really thinking about this one. What kind of research should we do? What kind of research into dementia is needed? Pete, we definitely want to hear what you think.
Yeah, let's not look so much at people who are living with dementia. The heartache that I have, and the disappointment that I have, and the fear that I have, is nothing compared to the adjustments and the fears and the worry of the people who are around me, my loved ones, my family, my carer. Because sometimes I'm in another place. And it's not a bad place to be, but they're living with me all the time, and they are witnessing my decline, and they love me, and it's hard for them. So some people are in denial, and will tell me off when I get something wrong. Other people are just too close, and won't give me the space that I need because I'm still quite able in most respects. So there's a whole rainbow of emotion going on amongst the people I know. And that's what worries me about my condition, the burden that I put and the worry that I give to the people around me. Not my own condition, I can manage that. So I wonder what we can do.
So to look at that whole network is what you mean.
Around the person.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting, and that's definitely what you tackle, Henrietta, with that particularly that scenario. And I love the way you pulled out. Well, she's always been late, because that's the other thing is that, you have your character and you are the person you are. So if you get any kind of diagnosis, you still have your own personality.
Yeah.
Did you?
And I think also with an aging person, and I know this is something my mother, who's now 86, has talked about for years, that women become invisible after a certain age. So there's already a sense, Mag's own character in the book already has a sense of, nobody's looking at me now anyway. So then people aren't noticing less. If you're not looking, you're noticing a lot less. So the other characters around her, some of them feel they have to play catch up because they've kind of taken their eye off her anyway. And it's sort of, oh, well, you're just an old lady toddling around, which is a very typical, I think, experience of a lot of older women.
Absolutely. And there's some really great work that people have done. Gosh, I can't remember the name of the author now, but she's done King, that's it. A really good book on about that, the invisibility of women and in literature and film and things as well. Absolutely. As we get older, that we tend to just kind of disappear. Did you want to come in, Caleb?
Yeah, that idea about kind of networks of care, and perhaps ones that are kind of invisible or rendered marginal by cultural representation, made me think of, there's an astonishing documentary by a documentary maker called Christoph Bilson, which is called Mother. And it's about a care home in Thailand where Western families kind of take loved ones who are in the late stages of dementia. And what's really incredible about the film, and I think this also is a response to ideas around appropriation as well, is that Bilson gives the carer her own camera. And so she films these really intimate moments, both with the people she's looking after, but also her own family. And she has this, it's about her own relationship as a mother to her own family, but also her relationship as a carer to these people who have kind of, who from families who feel like they can't care for them, but who have the economic means because they are privileged Westerners in order to be able to do that. And I suppose it kind of exposes, these things which perhaps are only opened up, and particularly, in my case, when I my only interactions with the care system were when my father kind of developed dementia, and then suddenly these kinds of things open up to you, and perhaps that's something that fiction can do, is start to reveal those things which are often hidden,
and kind of give people a sense that they're not alone. Because definitely when we had our reading groups with the carers, that they got so much from the group dynamic, of having a discussion together and saying, well, that's me, that's not me, or I found that, but the point is that they this extract that they were reading and this character's experience was giving them something that they could discuss, and something to kind of unite around, which was really interesting. Did you want to come back in, Sarah?
Yeah, there's so much, isn't there, being opened up here. I think the idea of relationality, which we're touching upon, and it came out beautifully in Henrietta's story, that sense that, and Pete made the same point, that a person living with dementia is living in a network, but also that sense of personhood, to go back to what Carla was saying, that in itself is part of the network, that your memories are not just yours, but they're someone else's. And that comes out very strongly in a lot of fiction about dementia, that sense that your sense of who you are is informed by, reflected by, and in interaction with the sense of who other people think that you are. And that comes out in Henrietta's story very clearly with Anita and Raylan's and the different kind of views they have of Mags. And it also relates back to that point you're making about aging and invisibility of women. And I think, perhaps we haven't got time to touch upon it, but I think gender is really important here, how this plays out in a gendered way. Mags is, because of who Mags is, because she's done the active mothering in Henrietta's novel, she is part of a real sense of relationality, even though her children, apart from Anita, live away. But she's very much embedded in a community, even though she hasn't lived there for a huge amount of time. And I think some of that is gendered. And some of that plays out in really interesting ways in fiction, and allows us to talk about these things, to think about dementia as a kind of intersection. A person living with dementia is not just a person living with dementia, but a father and a mother. And I think fiction really allows us to think through that, and to think about what emotions that might evoke. Anita is very hurt and very angry, and so is Raymond at various points in the novel, and they're allowed to be that in the novel because, as Gemma was saying, they're fictional. So I think there's a real value in that.
Mm-hmm. And I think it allows people to. Oh, sorry, go on, Peter. Go on.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm just going to open things up even more here, if I may. Sorry, you reply, but we're talking about support networks here. I'm very concerned that people from the LGBT community don't have those support networks. Many people from that community are not in stable relationships and may well have alienated themselves from their families. They're alone. They're lonely. And at the moment, there's not much in place at all to help people in that situation, because it's difficult, although Zoom has made things easier for people to connect. Unless people hold their hands up, they'll just drown alone. There's no support network out there for them, and those lonely people are the people who need our help the most, I think.
Such a good point, Pete, because this is going to be not just people from LGBT plus, it's also going to be more and more of an issue in the future, because the people are having fewer children, people are having or no children at all, people are living alone, and that actually future generations of older people are less likely to have this, several children that could perhaps share that task of caring for an older relative. So we need to start working on those friendships. And we need to start, having friendships with younger people. That's my plan. That's my aging plan. Get lots and lots of young friends. Henrietta, were you going to come in?
Yeah, it was just actually about the point about the other characters' reactions. And I think this is what you were saying, Sarah. It's the idea of exploring what other people around in that network think. But I also wanted to have them being really pissed off and refusing to help. Because I think that's a genuine, everybody doesn't leap on board being, I'm sure, Peter, you could speak to this way more than I can, but that there's people in the book who think, I don't want anything to do with this. I don't care if she's my mother. This isn't something I can cope with. So I kind of wanted an opportunity to play through the reactions around it as well and allow them to be honest and unpleasant and messy and all of the things I think they are in real life.
Absolutely. So, and it's just, the gender thing comes in there so clearly as well, because for some people, they can say, no, I'm not interested in it, and I don't want to do it, and it's not my role. And for women, you can, very strong social pressure not to say that, that it is supposed to be your role. So what we haven't really addressed is Sarah's first question, really. Is there a danger of appropriation?
Well, I think there's a danger of appropriation in everything, I suppose, if you want to look at it. I think all fiction, or most fiction in a way, has some element of appropriation if you're stepping into somebody else's life, which is what you're trying to do when you're writing a character, is to create a character that is believable, but is outside your own experience. My last book was set in 1938 from the perspective of a man who forges a sequel to Dracula, again, completely outside many
definitely outside your experience.
So for that, I feel once you are trying to inhabit the character respectfully and you do the research properly, I don't find appropriation as an issue for me. Certainly in writing this book, I felt that I was trying to represent the experience of just this one person, not everybody with dementia. I can't do that. I'm trying to represent this one single character and get her life absolutely right. And I did use a lot of real life sources when I was researching rather than other fiction to research it.
Yes.
But I think that for me was the key, was using non-fiction sources to create fiction, mainly.
Have you come across it, Sarah, do you think? Or it's something that I really, really struggled with at the start of this project. And when we were writing the proposal, I was really worried about using fiction because being such a literal, social scientist, I'm like evidence, data driven. And I did feel nervous about using fictional accounts, and I've become much more comfortable with it for lots of different reasons. But have you ever come across think that this isn't appropriate in anything that you've analysed?
Yes, although I wouldn't want to name them.
You don't have to.
I've come across things I don't like, that I don't think are particularly helpful representations, shall we say. But, we've also got to remember that representations are forged in their moment. So, they respond to various things. A lot of the early memoirs about dementia, for example, were doing a certain job. In the 80s and 90s, when the climate they were written in was very different. So I didn't pose that question. I was when I was writing these questions, I was on the panel with people who are writers. So I didn't pose those questions to suggest that, I think this is something that necessarily happens, just that I think it's something that writers are aware of, perhaps, and we're aware of maybe as readers as well. I think it underpins a lot of our discussions. We're sort of tiptoeing around it, but we know it's there. And, that there's this kind of fear, even if you're kind of, it's your creative impulse and you are going to overcome that and do a very necessary job, which is why I started with the idea that I do think these representations are necessary. That doesn't mean that there aren't things we might want to think about. I don't think there's a scale on which you measure a representation in any easy way. They're contextually driven.
Definitely. And I really think that you really made me think when you said, but what about readers as well? Can readers appropriate? And then I was thinking, of course, different readers will have different responses to the same thing, and one person might think it's totally inappropriate, and another person might be perfectly happy with it, depending on their experience. So it isn't something that we can control and measure in the way that I've been trained to do. So I've become much more. I've become educated in that sense. You look like you're having a really interesting thought there, Caleb. Are you having a really interesting thought that you'd like to share?
I'm sort of no. I'm just recognizing how unresolved that question is for me, I suppose. I mean, it's an absolutely central question for me. To the extent that I attempted to write a kind of short story about my father, and I ended up actually writing a kind of radio play that was directly talking to him, because I couldn't find a way of integrating his experience. It just felt artificial. It felt violent, and actually just treating it as the intervention it was, the act of communication that it was, because ultimately he was the audience that I was trying to communicate with. And now I'm not sure where I am. My only other thought on this is that one of the things I found really powerful actually about Henrietta's book is the use of free and direct discourse, which has come up before, which seems to me a way of acknowledging both being sort of on the inside and outside of a person. And I suppose that the kind of language of a person who you might be talking to or sort of near comes into your sense of them or your sense of yourself. And so I think the way that I'm approaching fiction now is almost to acknowledge its artificiality. That's what I'm interested in. But that may be just a kind of way of assuaging my writerly sort of qualms. I don't know about you, Pete, whether that matters to you at all when you're reading fiction, or what?
I'm an avid reader. I have been all my life, but I've never yet met a dispassionate reader. You don't want a dispassionate reader, do you?
Yeah.
You want your audience to measure what you're saying against their own life experience, and they will. And so in their head, they'll be critical of some of the things that they don't recognise that you're writing about. But that doesn't make them any less valid. You've got to give your reader, I think, the credit to be grown up enough to understand that they're reading someone else's story, and that story is valid for them, and that they're privileged enough to be looking through a window on it. If they don't realise that, then they're probably literary critics, aren't they?
And also when you start to study it in more detail, there are so many different approaches and so much talent and creativity that these writers have. So like one of the most famous ones is Out of Mind. And at the end of that book, it kind of, the language breaks down. It's from the internal perspective of the person with dementia. And it's actually quite harrowing to read, but absolutely incredibly effective, and it makes you feel uncomfortable and it makes you think, and it really puts you into the shoes of Martin. Now, we have a question from Christine. I'm going to just squint slightly because it's quite far away from me. Do you think readers will simply see the fictional narrative as underpinning their own perception, or should fiction be used to challenge societal perceptions about dementia? Good question, Christine. Anybody want to answer that one?
I think that depends on the reader. That's sort of two questions, isn't it?
It is.
It disappeared from my screen, but it's partly about readers and partly about what novels can do and what they should do. I don't think we have to enjoy all novels to definitely challenge societal perceptions. And as Jane was saying earlier, I think it was Jane, they don't. Some do kind of reiterate some of the narratives, broader cultural narratives we talked about, because they're shaped within them, and they may do both at the same time as well. Novels don't always do just one thing. So I think this is a really good question, because it kind of gets to the heart of some of the key concerns, and I don't know that there's an easy answer to it. But the other thing is, I think it goes back to what Pete was saying about readers. I think readers do. I think readers in general probably do look for a relationship with a character and like empathy and sympathy with all of those things. But I also think that novels like Out of Mind, they really challenge that. They really push you to the edge of that. They push you away at various points, I think, and don't just allow for any kind of easy relationship. And perhaps there's a value in that too.
Yeah, you're not allowed to kind of gloss over anything with that book. You're brought right into the maelstrom. Do you know what I love about this question as well is that it actually, pinpointing something that we're doing in the early analysis stage now of these reader responses. And this is one of the things that we're finding really interesting, is that people do tend to feel that, readers tend to feel that they cannot have a legitimate response, say, to a particular, event that happens to the character with dementia, unless they can relate it to their own experience. So they'll say, yeah, that's like my dad, or that's like, my wife, or whatever. They'll try and say, or excuse my ignorance, but is that, what normally happens? Or so actually, even just having, I think, fairly accurate, well-researched representations of dementia is useful. There's another question. Can I ask Pete? So this is as a writer. So this is coming from Jan. She wants to ask Pete, she's a writer who's about to begin a novel with a major character living with dementia. Where should she begin her research or writing process, Pete?
Gosh, okay. Come and speak to us. Come and speak to us, people who are living with dementia. We're all around you. 1 in 7 people will, sadly, have dementia in their lifetime. 1 in 4 people will know someone with dementia. We're all around you, and there's one thing we like is it's the sound of our own voices. So that's a good place to start. I don't know if you've heard of Admiral Nurses. Admiral Nurses are wonderful people. They're very experienced with people with all types of dementia and all stages of dementia, and they'll give you a dispassionate view of what the journey is like for many people.
That's a good idea, actually, because they'd probably have experienced lots of different types of people and lots of different types of dementia and everything. So that could be really rich. Another question. We know the power of language. Do you see a role in fiction for promoting more appropriate language in relation to dementia, such as positive metaphors? That's a bit of a hard question. I know Caleb would have an interesting answer. We'll give him a second.
Sorry, go on.
Go for it, if you have a response to that. Just the role of language, because you were just talking about how difficult it was to go in as first person talking about your dad's experience.
I mean, I would say yes, but I would say with the quite large caveat that I would support what Henrietta's saying, that literature isn't always positive or what you want to hear, right? I mean, that it might be that there's a kind of rebarbative reading experience, which is nevertheless incredibly powerful and a kind of opportunity for reflection, and that might take you beyond the kind of inherited stereotypes. But it may not be obvious that that's what it's doing when you first encounter the text.
Yeah, that's true.
There's a role literature can play, and not that it has to, but that it can, in enriching the vocabulary, enriching our imaginative capacity. In fact, I think it's already doing it. It's already done it in recent years. Not that it's finished, but it's already enriched, I think, our imaginative capacity when it comes to life with dementia and living with dementia. And my colleague Alison Waller, who was here earlier, she's just written about metaphors of floating and falling in some recent young adult fiction about dementia and cognitive impairment as well, more broadly. And that's really interesting. Look at how you might expand the imaginative vocabulary around dementia.
Absolutely, but don't tell your readers that people suffer with dementia. I'm not suffering with dementia. If anybody's going to be suffering, it's my friends and family. I'm quite happy living with dementia, to tell you the truth. It's okay. It gives me a good excuse for not doing things.
I have an interesting question as well that I've been annoying the linguists and literary people in our group with for quite a while, which is, when you take a book like Still Alice that's written by Lisa Genova, and it's constantly referred to as, she has this training as a neuroscientist, and she got so sick of, trying to hand people pamphlets that she said, I'm just going to write a story. So she wrote this story, Still Alice, and of course it's massively popular, and, this in the movie and everything. But she's not, going to win a huge, literary prize. And then you have much more literary books. So something like Out of Mind, which is absolutely like brilliant piece of literature, if you ask me. So is there a danger that we try to kind of represent things in a way that's quite clunky from the literary perspective, but might do quite a good job in terms of tackling the societal perspectives? Or is that something that just grates when you come across these kind of books?
I feel there's space for all of them. Like, I think it's a very big cairn, and if each thing is bringing one stone to it, then it's just going to increase. You know, I don't doubt. I didn't read the book Still Alice, but I did see the film, and I don't doubt that actually positively altered some people's perceptions of people they knew or were in their network. You know, so I do think there is space for everything, really. Once the character is something that people can relate to, you know, that people can understand and want to see and are invested in and want to see what happens to them.
And Alice is, you know, she's a very high-ranking academic, and then the loss is supposed to be, you know, such a high fall then from somebody with this kind of very high level of cognition. But I think what that did in terms of having a kind of a cultural relevance is it may have had an influence in terms of making people think that early onset is more common than it is, but it's actually really quite rare.
I know the Alzheimer's Society here used it in they did an advertising campaign based around it. It was the idea being still me. It was trying to get people to look at who you are apart from that diagnosis. And that actually was quite successful for them, just trying to round out people's ideas a little bit.
Yeah, because then that's the other kind of half of my question is, so if it does do something that isn't really very accurate, like say that early onset is more common than it actually is that a problem in terms of the ethics? But that's more like the reader's ethics, isn't it? That's your point, Sarah, like how we read things. And if it's because something becomes very popular, that's not Lisa Geneva's problem, you know, that's ours. But we were the ones that bought it.
There's so much at stake in how narratives get received. It's not just the individual reader, but it's the broader cultural discourse. It's the publishing houses, it's the media, it's the way they get picked up in certain ways, and then it's who gets cast in the film adaptation. And you know, you're looking at so many things that are at play there that it's no longer. It's definitely not about. Well, it is about the individual reader as well, but it's a much greater kind of sense of networks and happenings and events that propel some text to that kind of stardom, if you like.
Yeah, you see.
At the expense of others. I mean, it's a bit like John Bailey's Iris becomes the text, you know, of memoirs about dementia, and kind of overshadows so many others that were published at the same time, previous to and subsequently, you know, that might do different things, shall we say.
Yeah, you never know what's going to really kind of hit the cultural vibe at the moment. There was a question there that has disappeared, but I'll try and remember it, which said, it was from somebody whose dad had dementia and her siblings used to get upset about her mentioning it on social media. So this is a good question for you, Pete, I think, and that thing of, you know, how that family network, those plates that you're spinning in terms of managing all those relationships, how does that kind of, how can people manage that? Or is there some kind of guide for us in dealing with that and how we speak about a family member with dementia in public?
Well, one of the first things I did straight after my diagnosis was come out of the dementia closet. I wrote a little note to everybody I knew, friends and family, and was straight onto social media to let people know about my diagnosis, because I'm not ashamed of it. It's one of those things. And not only that, I didn't want people to feel uncomfortable around me when they saw the changes appearing in me. Actually, most people already had a clue. This goes back to your talk about young onset dementia now. I too think that there are many more people living with young onset dementia than we know. They just haven't been diagnosed yet, because the process of diagnosis is so bad. People are misdiagnosed for many years very often before they're finally given a diagnosis of dementia.
That's a really good point.
People know. I'm from my point of view, I'm quite comfortable with people talking about my diagnosis and my dementia, and talking about me. Anything that that puts dementia into the mainstream, I think, and makes people more comfortable with dementia, must help anyone who's living with dementia.
Good point.
It integrates us.
Yeah, exactly. And makes us all part of the conversation as opposed to kind of, you know, siloing or ghettoizing. That's a really, really good point. So We have a few minutes left. I haven't seen any more. There should be some more questions coming in, but maybe I'll go back to some of the questions. Some of the questions that Sarah had put to us earlier. And it's probably a good question for us to kind of round up on, because it leads into the third panel, which is around diversity in dementia fiction. Because one of the first things we discovered when we started this project was that there were so many older white ladies who were the protagonists of these dementia fiction novels. So we just set out on a quest led by Jan to really look for diversity in dementia fiction. And that's what we're going to discuss in the next panel, which will begin at 3:00. But we have a couple of minutes left here. So what I would like us to do for those couple of minutes is to really trying to tackle that question of whose stories are told, and what can we do to kind of try and make sure that more stories are being told. You have tried to tell your dad's story, Caleb. Have you thought about other ways that, or other experiences that could be, or other omissions even in the literature that you've observed?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are huge omissions everywhere. And I think it's, in that sense, you can see that there are huge possibilities for writers that open up. I also think we can look forward, and I look forward kind of with excitement to the ways that people might open up the field. But I think it's also working backwards and thinking that there's a whole history of literature which is not explicitly about dementia, but which will say all sorts of interesting things about change, about perception, and about aging. It was really fascinating to hear Tess talk about Beckett and Lear earlier, but I was also thinking about, Ovid's Metamorphoses and the kind of strange changes that might go on in somebody's life, the kinds of, and it's very playful and ludic, and so we might sort of see things that are relevant to us now in older literatures as well.
Yes, that we might start to see, this actually is a dementia text, but we didn't know it was that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, yes, our omission in our observation as well. And those kind of, as Tess was talking about Beckett and things, so that's kind of a particular kind of white older man as well. So just before we wrap up, has anybody any last comment they'd like to make or anything? No? Okay. Well, listen, I will just say that it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. For all of our audience out there, the next panel is at 3:00. It's Diversity in Dementia Narratives, as I mentioned. And Jan Carson, who is our resident writer and ACE organizer and generally amazing person, she's going to chair that. And she has, I know, a really, really beautiful, emotive piece from Rachel Hegarty about working class representations of dementia experiences. And then she has Bindi Desi and Baz Groves, who are going to talk about different kind of ethnic backgrounds and things like that in terms of really addressing this gap that we've identified around having diverse representations in dementia narratives. So thank you so much, Pete. Thank you, Henrietta. Keep writing. It's just fantastic. Thank you, Caleb and Sarah. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you. And I will leave it there. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.